Welcome, Plato community. It's so great to be here. I am Janice Little, SVP of Engineering at Sheer ID. We're an identity marketing platform. We help brands to create personalized gated offers for students, military, healthcare workers, and other influential consumer tribes. With me today is Jean-Denis Grez, Head of Engineering at Plaid. I'm really excited to moderate this discussion on qualities of a great senior engineering leader. So welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Janice. It's great to be here. Thank you to Plato and the whole community. My name is Jean-Denis. I'm head of engineering at Plaid. We're a company in the fintech space that help consumers connect their bank accounts to most of the fintech apps in the US and Canada and increasingly in Europe. I've been there 4 years, joined when it was about 20 engineers. We're 225 today and growing quickly. So I run engineering, support, and design. I was at Dropbox before that, where I ended as a director of engineering. I was there for 4 years. And then before that, I worked in tech in New York, but in a little bit different segment of tech. So working in that kind of hedge fund space. And then I studied, interestingly, CS undergrad a long time ago in the 1990s, worked during the first internet bubble, but I had a stint as a lawyer for a bit, which somehow still colors my approach to some certain problems. So excited to chat.
It's great. We won't hold that against you. So just to tee this off, I'll just dive into start the discussion with a couple questions, and then we can move into QA. So for the audience, please feel free. I'm not sure which direction it is to just post your questions in the Q&A and upvote. So let's just start with, what's been the biggest challenge for you as an engineering leader, and how has this evolved over time?
Sure, it's a good question. I think, and I'm going to answer it from the perspective of leadership versus management. So I think there's one realization and then two skills that I think I've really had to develop as I went from managing, say, 80, 70 people, kind of director level, to upwards of 100. So the first one is the first realization is I can no longer step into the details. And that really bothers me because I'm quite technical still, and I really enjoy technical decision-making, product decision-making. I enjoy talking to customers. What I've learned is that I can't do that, not for the traditional reason, right? The traditional management reason not to go into the details because you're stopping your engineers from being empowered and from having full ownership over their domain. But as a leader of like a 200-person org, that's not the reason why I can't go into the details. The reason I can't go into it is because I'm wrong, because I no longer have enough domain-specific information where what I say is actually the correct answer. And like more often than not now, I actually think my judgment is wrong. And what's interesting about that is people won't tell me as a leader. And I've done it. I've gone in a spec and I've innocuous comment on the side of a spec where I'm like, oh, have you considered X or Y or Z approach? And then what happens is people over-index on the comment. And some people interpret it as like, that's what Jean-Denis wants us to do. And so it's not even, they don't even look at it as a question. They look at it as a directive. And so the skill there that you have to learn is you have sometimes to be directive, but you have to do it in a way where people can still question you. Because if you do it in a way where they don't feel comfortable questioning you, you're going to get suboptimal results because you don't have the time and you're not in the details enough. And that's been a skill that's been hard to develop because you don't get much feedback on it. You only get the feedback when you realize people made the wrong decisions because of some little thing that you did or because you express yourself in the wrong way at an all hands and so on and so forth. So that's the realization. And then the two skills that I've had to develop beyond that are creating more time for strategic thinking. It sounds stupid, but I do this. I would go walk around during my week. I block out a few hours of time every week, and I just go walk with a pen, not my phone, a pen and a piece of paper. And I force myself to think about things that I'm not thinking in the day-to-day. That's probably the most valuable time that I spend every week because it forces me to consider things that aren't part of the moment, right? It's not like, how do I get this closed? It's not, how do I reorg this team? It's like, what am I not thinking about that's critical for the business and for engineering in the next 2 years? So that's like one tip, I think, as a leader, that you need to find that space because there's so much stuff coming at you that you just be a reactive beast if you don't protect your time. And then the final thing, I call this the haircut analogy. This is like, I hope this catches on at some point, but I don't think it will. So it's great. I love, and I'm getting better at just cutting things on my teams, not from the work that I do, but literally like cutting teams, cutting projects. And the reason I call it the haircut analogy, it's like this. It's like your hair gets too long, right? And then you cut it. And it sucks to cut it. Like it seems fun in the moment, you look good for a day, but then for a couple of weeks, you don't look that good, right? Because generally the haircut, like the hairdresser puts a bunch of stuff on your hair. Sorry, it's a little gendered because I don't know that much about women's haircutting, but I assume it's kind of similar. You look really good.
Spot on. You're good. You're good.
You come out, you look amazing. So then, but the next couple of weeks, it's kind of painful, right? It's like regoing, and then you hit the sweet spot for like a month where like things feel really, really good. And then it gets too long, gets messy, you have too much of it, you get split ends, and then you have to cut it again. Well, teams are the same way, right? Engineering teams are the same way. It's like you cut them to the right place, and then it doesn't feel right for a bit because people are pissed off. You like cut some teams, you reorg some things, it's not good. Then you get to a point where suddenly you're like humming. The machine is going and you're great for a certain period of time. And then you stop realizing it, but your hair is getting too long. Your team's getting too big. It's not aligned with the business anymore. And what you do as a leader is you wait. Just much like I don't like making haircut appointments. I wait too long to do the next set of cuts because it's kind of painful. It's like kind of sucks. I know I'm going to look bad for a couple of weeks, but you have to do it. And so I think the more of a senior leader I've become, the more I realize that like your org is just accumulating the wrong things. It's like maybe like a tree that's like growing too many branches and you have to call, and you have to actively do that. And it's almost like you can't do it too much. Like I always feel like I'm doing it too late. So I'm trying to get to a point where I'm much more active at cutting things along the way so that we can stay in that zone, that perfect zone, as long as possible.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And you know, I love the haircut analogy. That's even probably more perfect during COVID, you know, when people are struggling to get haircuts. But absolutely. I mean, I love, you know, talking about like resisting the temptation to just, you know, I'm going to, you know, go down 3 floors and whiteboard with the team, you know, just, you know, having people over index on leaders. I remember also, you know, in terms of protecting your time, I remember reading a book called The Manager's Path, and it had these like matrices about like priority and urgency. So like, how do you know, there's obvious work and there's these tempting distractions, and then how do you make that thinking time for, you know, the strategic stuff that you really just need to make time for. So I think that's really helpful to everybody who's out there listening. And the other part is like, how do you now use all these extra things to like build your, you know, build opportunities for other developers who are and other, you know, potential leaders and rising stars to start developing these skills by giving them, you know, complex but not urgent challenges. So I love it. That's great. So let's talk a little bit about how you reconcile incentives. So how do you reconcile an incentive for the individual versus incentives for the company?
I mean, I have a kind of a YOLO answer, but that I really like. I actually think you kind of shouldn't reconcile. And so,
ooh, I love it.
Yeah,
tell me more.
I think you should the incentives should be what's right for the company. And I think so this is something we've done at Plaid, I think, very well. Like many things at Plaid we haven't done very well, but this I think we've gotten right for our kind of business. I'm very open with my teams, which is like, I am making decisions that are right for the business, not that are right for the individuals. Now, I try as much as possible to align an individual's work or a team's work with what people want to do, right? So you want to learn, you want to become a mobile developer, right? If we have a company priority to do mobile work and we don't have enough people staff there, I will work with you to develop that skill set and to move you onto that team, right? If you want to become a manager and we have an opportunity for a junior manager role, as opposed to hiring someone externally, right? If you've shown that you've developed some of the skills like mentorship, help with close and recruiting, you will get a shot at becoming a manager, but only if these things are important for the business. And if they're not important for the business, then I'm sorry about your individual incentives. Now, okay, why? But just imagine, okay, here's what happens, right? I'm open about it. I don't lie to people. I don't tell people like, hey, listen, like I really care about you so much, and I care about you so much that I'm going to put you in front of the business. I don't tell that to you. I don't pretend that I'm trying to find a balance between. I'm very open and direct about it. I'm open in my Ents chat, and I'm open about it in my one-on-ones with my managers, and so on and so forth. And the end result is this, right? Some people don't like it, and they just opt out of Plaid, and that's fine. But whoever's left, right? Everyone's mentality is like team, business, team before me, and everyone like truly believes that. And we've created a great culture, right? So in practice, we are finding often opportunities for people to pursue what they want, right? And that matches their individual incentives, but not every time. And when we tell people like, hey, listen, we have this bag of tech debt over there, and we're gonna need a team to spend 6 months to fix it. And I know you don't like this kind of work, but it's the most important thing for the business. People actually don't complain because they buy into the idea that we are all going to make decisions that are the right ones for the company. That's my answer. And I actually think this is the right answer for everybody. And what happens is people will find companies and jobs that match their personal incentives. And that's like a much better outcome, right? Especially in a world, by the way, where if you're like an engineer in like anywhere right now, it's like so easy to find a job. Like, like let people find the jobs, right? And why don't you create a team that matches up what the business really needs? That's like more powerful. So that's my answer. I don't know if that I would love your reaction. I would love your reaction.
I am 100% product focused engineers on my team as well. And you're right. Sometimes you have to help people graduate to a different company, if you don't have like an overlap between what people want to do and what's best for the business. And yeah, I'm 100% on board. And for everybody out there, I mean, I think, take a look at what incentives you have lined up, right? I mean, bonuses, I see personal OKRs, I see, sort of these tours of duty negotiated with a manager about, maybe something's changed, I'm much more likely to ask somebody what impact they want to make versus like what they're interested in. Right. So, I think that's great.
Actually, I really like the last thing that you said. And look, I'm not a socialist, so it's not like I think I know what's best for other people. But look, in my experience, people like ICs and managers who are impact focused, that's what they care about. And they don't really care about what the work is as long as it has impact. Those people actually have really successful careers, right? And if you can change your own value system, right, to be like, what matters to me isn't a hard technical problem, but what matters to me is having impact, you'll be happy in a whole lot of places, right? And that's a pretty powerful mindset to have. I don't know how you teach that, but I really like the way you put it there.
It's fun, and like you said, people will self-select, or we're happy to help them, move on to a place where they really are sort of exploring the interests that they have, and that's healthy and that's good. There are graduates, and that's good too. Sometimes they boomerang. So let's talk a little bit about hiring an engineering manager. When you look for an engineering manager, what are some of the qualities that you index on? What are you looking for particularly?
It's tough. I mean, the non-generic answer is, I don't want all my engineering managers to be the same. So, right, I want them to have skills that are specific to kind of the domain that they're attacking and the kind of team that they're going to lead. But if I were to think of what are the things in common, the first one is, it's stupid. It's ownership, and sorry everybody.
It's not stupid.
Here we are. We're back. Basically, and by which I just want people who go beyond their mandate to get stuff done. And so last week I was talking to someone who reports to the CEO of a FANG, right? So definitely more senior than I am, very senior. And we were talking about how do you do talent identification. And I was curious. I was like, at your company, your large FANG, how do you identify best talent? And what they said was, hey, I look for people consistently who jump across functional and organizational lines to deliver projects. So it's like the PM who writes some code or does the first copy of marketing, or who's really effective at getting the BD team to like work on their thing, right? Or like the engineering manager whose engineers feel comfortable working in other team systems, but in a collaborative way, because that way they're not blocked on another team. The director who consistently loans their engineers to projects that are more impactful than the ones that they have. he's like, because at a large FANG, right, they're more focused on identifying talents internally than externally. So he's like, what we really try to do is find these people that cross boundaries to get impact. And we find that is a repeatable skill. Like you take that person, you can put in another domain and that will translate really well. Whereas other things like, deep expertise on like running a really efficient team around process, like that might not scale to something else. And so that's what I look for in interviews for engineering managers. And so I have an interview. I have one, but we have one where we try that. We don't ask that question. We don't ask the question like, hey, can you tell us about when you work cross-functionally? We ask people to just describe projects where they had to unblock things. And we just push really hard to find like their dimensions of thinking around unblocking. And so that tells us a little bit about ownership. But I think it's honestly, even at a 200-person team, I really focus on identifying the people internally who've done so. And that will lead to interesting like observations. So one of them that I have is one of my best engineers is like 5 years of experience. And effectively he's been at Plaid no less, 4.5, has been at Plaid their whole career. But like literally like top 5 in terms of impact consistently. And I was asking my engineering directors, like, why is this person so good, right? And we're like, oh, because he does this cross-functional thing. And then we're like, well, why does he do the cross-functional thing? And this was really interesting. It was like, well, because he knows all the systems, right? Because they've been here long enough and so then we're like, okay. So if that's what's happening, how do we get other people to have that skill set? Because he's showing the ownership, but also the knowledge. And so what I found, and I think there's a gap there that's like interesting to look at, which is people who want the ownership, but they don't feel empowered, or people who have the ownership and they don't have the knowledge to get things done. And these are organizational issues. So, So we'll go back to your question about engineering managers. I try to find people who have that, but you have to be realistic that within certain organizations, you can't show off that ownership skill set. And so I think it's a little dangerous to index on it too much during the interview process, because if someone may want to do it, but they may just have worked at a company where it's not possible to do, and they might actually thrive at Plaid. So the second dimension, I love self-awareness. I don't think I'm the most self-aware person in the world, but I try to go for it in interviews. And I love people who are very open and direct about their failures. That's how and who are vulnerable in the interview process. It's hard to be vulnerable in the interview process, but look, management's really hard. Building companies is really hard. Building products is hard. We make mistakes all the time. I make mistakes all the time. Wrong decisions that a quarter later you catch and you fix. And I think the person whose mindset is like, I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to own up to them with my reports, with my lead, with my peers. We're going to like retro. We're going to understand what I can do better next time, and I will learn from it. That person, if I think I'm going to work with that person for 4, 5, 6 years, that's going to be great. They can take feedback, right? They're going to increase their skill set. So I look for that. I look for that vulnerability, that self-awareness, willingness to talk about failures in the interview process. And I think that actually correlates really well to people who have a growth mindset, more so than asking, do you have a growth mindset? Because who doesn't have a growth mindset, Janice? Do you have a growth mindset, Janice?
Absolutely.
Tired.
I love it. Yeah, I mean, it's important to talk about challenges and, like you said, how they handle, when they fail. I think it's absolutely true. And, how they handle it with you in the interview, but also, with their team at the time. Did they own up to it? And how do they navigate that situation, right? Like, if you don't talk about challenges, you don't get to see, okay, if they have good instincts around, what are the right questions to ask, and what are the next steps, right? Like to making sure it doesn't happen again, or getting out of the challenge. So I love it. Let's talk about like just broad. We touched on it a little bit already, but broad engineering management ideology. So how would you describe yours?
Probably the best thing that comes up is I'm a big believer in bottom up kind of like management ethos throughout the org. And there's this phrase, which is, as a manager, you're like serving the team, right? And you're there to make the team effective. I really truly believe in that. And so I spend a lot of time trying to empower folks to feel like they can make business important decisions, either bottom up or in smaller units of folks. And the reason, look, you ask management philosophy, like, is it really a philosophy or is it a is it like, how do you implement a philosophy? Like, I think my management philosophy is, look, great people will do great things if you put them in a box where they can do great things, right? And your job as a manager is to kind of create the boxes, right? And you need boxes, right? Because there's like 600 people working together or whatever. Like, you have to define some boundaries, you have to provide some lanes. I think that's the job, but I think it works best when the boxes are more, they feel more like incentives for people bottom up to come up with solutions than when they are like really strongly directional. So that's my philosophy. Interestingly, in my last performance review, some of my leaders told me that I'm too bottom up, which I like kind of blew my mind. But it highlights like you need to own up that there are still decisions that you have to make top down, right? Like people in 17 teams aren't going to decide magically together one day to like re-architect a common component that they're all built on top of. Like you have to give that direction from the top, right? There's definitely some things that aren't going to happen bottom up, but I still feel like if you can make the majority of the work really leverage the creativity and intelligence of the individuals that you spent so much time hiring, I think that's powerful. And for me, I said engineering here a lot. Me, bottom up is like necessarily cross-functional, right? Because if it's bottom up, you can't go up to like align the different people. It literally, like the perfect world is where you have a designer, a PM, an engineer, a support person, a PMM that's connecting them to someone from sales, like for a B2B. And like that unit of folks kind of feel like they've got some segment of users or some part of the problem that it's up to them to solve together as a group. And they don't need to ask like permission for everything, right? Like as long as they like abide by some security principles, some privacy principles, like as long as it's within the rough high level strategy of the company, like they can make a lot of decisions. So that's what I enjoy it. So the selfish part of this is probably not the right organizational model for lots of businesses. And I just wouldn't go work at those businesses. But I think for something like Plaid, where there's a decent amount of like engineering, product design led creativity, it's great.
That is great. I hear a lot about this like U-shaped planning. I don't know which direction the U is, but where things are funneling up, and then it's your job as the leader to sort of distill, because there's no shortage of good ideas, right? To kind of distill down to what would be most impactful for the business. Definitely on board. What about like? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to add. So it's interesting because one of my other like tools is I try to turn prioritization decisions into allocation decisions, meaning like I actually don't want to make a decision between 7 potentially really high impactful projects that are coming up to me from different places. For me, bottom up, it would be more like I've decided that I'm okay having 3% of engineering working on this rough area and 4% on that area, and then they got to decide what they want to do within each of the buckets, like fully. That's like the perfect version, because I think resource allocation is much easier than prioritization. And I want to have a really easy job. Like the easier my job is, like the better I sleep at night.
I love it. Has anything changed over time in kind of how you approach these things?
Yeah. I mean, yeah. I don't think I have a good answer to that. But yes, lots of things. I mean, look, it's all work in progress, right? And this is the thing about like the high level questions are riddled in the day-to-day practice with exceptions, organizations that don't allow you to be bottom up, right? Incentives that aren't like clear to individuals so that they resort to their individual incentives because you haven't created the right business ones. So I think all the learnings on these things it's like a nice ideal picture. And then when the rubber hits the road, right, you've got to adapt it to the business need. And that's what I think I've gotten better at over the last 8 years as a leader.
Yeah, absolutely. I could echo some of that as well. I feel like, just this at point, when I hire an engineering manager, I'm really hiring like a cultural leader, more than anything. And, their job is that communication and debugging teams and continuous improvement and that kind of thing. Let's talk about success. How do you measure success, and how do you help your team achieve success?
I kind of want your answer on this one. I'll probably just answer the how do you measure success. So when I ever advise companies, they're asking me like, how do I know if my engineering team is efficient? And my answer is always like, does it matter? What matters, again, is to go back. is the engineering team serving the business? So I go to my CEO, right, and my CFO, and I'm like, oh, listen, these are the product goals that we can support in the next 12 months, and this is how much budget we want. And then their answer is going to be like, that's good enough. Yes, we're happy. If you can get those goals for that much money, like, I'm game. Or they may say like, no, the business needs to IPO in X number of years, and this is what the metrics look like for other companies. And so you're going to need to do this for 80% of the cost that you're asking for. But it's a contract between humans, you know? And then after that, my job is just to make sure that we meet the contract. And if the CEO is happy with it, it doesn't really matter if I'm efficient or not. I'm successful for the business, right? And so that's like, and I think that's like the easiest, simplest way to think about it. It's just about the contract between engineering and the rest of the business. Now, in practice, right, when at Plaid, when we were small, I basically could hire as much as I wanted to because I couldn't, right? Like recruiting was we didn't have great brand recognition and so on and so forth. So at that point, it was just about who cared about costs. It was like, can you deliver impact? So it was about the way my conversation with CEO was about velocity. It's just about like, can we iterate faster? Can we ship faster? Right? Easy. Now, right? Because we just raised a nice round, and we're like, hey, what does an IPO look like in a few years? I don't know if I was supposed to say that. Eventually, one day in the future, we will IPO. So now it's much more, right? It's like now the costs seem to matter, and so the efficiency of the team again is like, we need to hit these product goals, but there's this new constraint added, which is I need to drive the efficiency in a curve where we're definitely growing headcount much lower than revenue, which isn't hard. It's just a new thing. And so now it's not efficiency, it's not velocity at all costs. But again, it's just a discussion. And I consider my team successful if it meets those lines that I'm agreeing with, other leaders of the company. I think there's other people who have like a much more like efficiency mindset, like maybe like how many story points you're shipping and is that moving in the right direction and so on and so on. And I think that's great. And I think my individual managers on my teams, like they think of their teams that way. But I really look at it, at a higher level. And like say our engineering team was like half as efficient as a competitor, but we were still winning in the market. Like it's just not what I'm going to go fight about. So, and then you asked about how do I help my teams achieve success. I think it just goes back to the points above. Like, look, my teams want to have business impact. And so actually, if they're not having business impact, they complain to me to no ends. Like they really do. They're like, this other function's blocking us. They're like, you didn't tell us soon enough that, about the new strategy. And so we've done work that we're just not happy about because we don't think it's aligned with business. They literally like tell me. And so my job, I think there, Chief says, I just listen. And I listen, and sometimes I can't do anything about it often, or like I ignore it, or I'm like, this is not the top 5 things that we can fix this quarter. But I think, I listen enough that I can help create the conditions for them to have the business impact that I've agreed to with, our CEO and our CFO and our CO and the C-suite.
Right.
But how do you think about it?
That's great. I mean, I love that you pointed out that, the metric the gauge of success there is very stage appropriate, right? So sometimes it just depends upon what the business is trying to achieve, how you're even going to go about looking at that measure. I think, for us, how do you, what people sometimes I see them struggle with is how you spend, how much time they spend determining what are the right, what are the right goals, which is a totally different probably discussion than this one. They focus on, how do you know if the company is setting the right goal? The team wants to know, am I succeeding? And for that, I just think, more time spent in choosing the right metrics can be really helpful there. Just, I see people that choose things that are too high level, or they're lagging indicators, or, and then they sort of lose faith and they sort of start prescribing solutions. So yeah, just definitely like how you define your outcomes starts to be really important there. And our team, I'll just say recently, maybe in the last 6 months, we've changed our outcomes to always be human behaviors, which has been really interesting and I think successful so far, but we'll have to in terms of a consumer or client or employee, even behavior. And that's been really interesting and positive for us. So I'll ask me in another 6 months if it's really working.
For internal, would behavior be like the result of a pulse score? It's more they're doing more of something. They're doing an activity that they wouldn't be doing otherwise.
Right. Like an example might be a refactor, right? Like every time I go into this code, it's taking me, it takes me, if I can say, okay, the behavior is going to be, it takes me 20% less time to work here.
Got it.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yep.
And it can be great. It can be enabling someone in another department or whatever. Okay. I'm going to jump over to Q&A. I want to make sure we leave enough time here. So, man, there's already so many great questions. Thank you, guys. Let's start with the top upvoted one. How do engineering leadership balance the gap with business leadership? So in the example here is the sales org is, if you don't hit the numbers, heads will roll. How do you convince your peers or the CEO with that mindset on engineering plans?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think what I'm reading in the lines is like, hey, how do you justify the big infrastructure project that has no clear business impact as something that's critical, say, to the long-term success of the business? And that one's hard. So I go back to my answer before, right? It's a contract between engineering and the business, but I don't actually go into that much detail about what engineering's working on, right? And so like Janice was talking about, hey, metrics, right? So what I might say, for example, is we're going to increase conversion rate by this much. We're going to launch these 2 new products, which we expect in the next 18 months to drive this amount of revenue in collaboration with sales. Like we have our list of things. And then what I tell them is it's going to cost $25 million a year in salary and another, $25 million a year in dilution. And I try to have the discussion at that level. Beneath the hood, right, they don't understand, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but they trust me to make the allocation between short-term impact and long-term things like technical debt or refactoring and so on and so forth. And so that's the way I try to quote unquote like structure the conversation. Because I think if I go to, and my experience has been in the past and at Plaid as well, which is if I go and I say, hey, listen, like we need to move to Kubernetes, blah, 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 and it's going to increase our ability to deploy, to do continuous deployment by this much, and it's going to simplify our stack, and we're going to save like 3% on AWS, like that won't work because that project is going to be, 15 engineers for 18 months or whatever. I'm totally making up the number, but it will be a 12+ month project. And so if I go and say that, they're going to be like, no. Let's build like an enterprise enablement team that works with sales because that's going to generate like 25 million in revenue in the next 12 months. But I know if I say, oh, you're right, that's the right trade-off, then I'm effed, right? So the answer to you is have long-term metrics, because your metrics need to look 18, 24 months out. And then I think treat all of engineering is like, hey, are we okay having 150 people like working towards achieving those high level goals? And you got to trust me that I am also protecting our ability to have velocity in the future. That's the one way. The other way, that's the way I do it. The other way that I've seen work well is to use an allocation mindset. And so you say like, hey, I've talked to a bunch of other VPNs and CTOs at other companies. And in practice, like in the industry, we tend to see 5% of the team is security, 15% is SRE and infrastructure. About 30% of everybody's time is spent keeping the lights on, right? And you have like a model for how allocations are happening. And obviously every company is different. So, but you can use that as a grounding truth, which is like, hey, you just got to accept that if we have a team of this size, or we have this much data, or we have this kind of a complexity of a surface area, just keeping the lights on and improving the infrastructure is going to cost this much, right? And then the third way, which I don't recommend, because I think it's really hard to have this conversation with your CEO, is to say, this project will drive velocity improvements over 4 years, right? And you go into the detail and you say like, this refactoring, this big investment in, like data labeling or whatever is gonna, over the long term, increase our velocity. That's just really hard in my experience with the CEOs that I've worked with and the boards, for them to internalize that level of decision, because it's like, you have to convince them of that for like 5 or 6 projects. And you can be a great engineering leader and do that, but you're much better working on a place where they trust you with that, right? Now, what happens if you don't meet the things, right? There has to be the same accountability that there is for their sales org. but it's just going to fall on you as a leader. And I think sales is wonderful because you do know where people stand in a very clear way, where it's still very difficult for engineering. Although at Plaid, we actually have one part of the house in engineering where it's really easy to measure individual like efficiency, but mostly I have not found that to be globally true. So that was a long answer. I hope it answered partially how the 3 approaches I would take and why I would recommend definitely the first one.
Yeah, I love it. That's helpful. Yeah, and for us, yeah, it's always about, what's the interest rate, right, on your tech debt, and what's the timing, and sometimes when I see this question asked, I sometimes wonder to myself, like, what percentage of the time is like the business leadership or the product team or whoever's suggesting, that we wait, like, correct, for the business. So I would say don't forget that part as well. Okay, let's go to the next question. This one's from Sean. Can you talk more about creating a high accountability, high impact culture, in particular in a fully remote environment?
Wow. I'm trying to think if I have something interesting to say. First, on the fully remote, I am like pretty far from my expertise, right? Plaid before the last 12 months and COVID was about 85% in-person team across 3 offices. We did have one engineering group that was remote first, but that was led by people who had operated very well in remote first worlds, and I trusted them to design the process and system that they needed for their parts of their work. So I'm not an expert on the remote end, and I don't know if I have a great deep insight there. For the first part of the answer, look, at the end of the day, I think if you want accountability and impact, so if you want impact, you need a way to measure impact. Could be revenue, could be number of story points that you're shipping. It could be you have KPIs or metrics 1 level down or 2 levels down from revenue that teams are striving for improvements on that you can kind of like measure, right? You can say like an increase to conversion is worth this much versus engagement for these features is worth that much. And you can say like, we'll take 2 units of one for 1 unit of the other. Like you might get that scientific, but you don't have to. But you need one way to measure impact. And then once you've measured it, you just communicate to the team. You're like, okay, this year we're focused on quality. And these are the 4 metrics that we're using to measure quality. And we're focused on these aspects of the customer experience, which are going to be defined by our SLA, our support response time, and how many support tickets customers can self-serve as opposed to having to interact with. You define the things. And then teams tell you how much they can drive things, and you ask them to commit. And I don't care if you use OKRs or goals, but you ask the teams, like, what will you do? You don't tell them, they tell you. They tell you, this is what we're going to do. You're like, okay, cool, write it down. And then you keep asking them, like, why are you off track? Why are you on track? What's happening? And accountability is about people telling you something and then achieving it, right? So the final part is what happens if they do. Well, if they do, maybe they get a higher rating. Maybe the whole team gets a spot bonus. Maybe you give the whole team like extra equity. I don't love team size incentive at Plaid's current size, but I think eventually it works well, right? And if they consistently don't hit it, and there's always excuses, then they're bad at planning, or there's a bad manager, there's a bad tech lead, right? And the ultimate version of accountability is somebody no longer has a job, right? And that's like, you didn't tell them what to do. You told them what metrics to optimize for. They came to you and they told you how much they thought they could drive it. And then did they do it or not? Now, that's the theory. And I think that works really well. So, right, identify the company goals, come up with KPIs that are leading indicators, ideally, get teams to tell you which KPIs they can drive by how much, right? See if they drive them. And if they don't, retro. The trick is if they don't, right? Because not all work is guaranteed to succeed. As a matter of fact, you don't want all of your work to be work that's 100% guaranteed. I mean, you do ideally, that'd be awesome world. But like you're taking risk. There's product risk, there's engineering execution risk, there's market risk, there's marketing risk. There's all these things that are there that you don't fully control. And so I think on the engineering side, sometimes you want teams to work on things that are 10% likely to work. And you want 10 teams doing that. Because if one of those 10 teams hits gold, it's really gold for the business. So what do you do with the other 9 teams? Do you not like comp them? That's why I don't like too much per team incentives. So when you don't hit your goals, I think you have to retro and you have to understand why it didn't work. And they're bad reasons. So like one bad reason is, oh, we didn't talk to customers until we had like the really hardened version built. Okay, so if that happens, like a PM is going to have some words and may no longer find themselves employed, right? Another one would be, oh, like the engineering timeline took twice as long as it could be. And I'll be like, oh, did we like write a spec? Did we do prototypes? Oh, we didn't do any of those things. Okay, so then a tech leader and engineering manager is going to find themselves in a tough spot. But you have to, right? You have to go one level deeper, I think, with things that aren't certain to understand what went wrong. And I don't, for me, things that go wrong all the time. So, for short projects that are 6 weeks, a quarter, you can get wrong a few times. You'll see if people learn. And then if they get it wrong too many times, you got to keep track, right? Look at, when you're doing performance review, look at their OKRs for their teams for the last, or their goals, however you set it. In the cases where it's a long project, like an 18-month project, you obviously not wait until the end of the project to determine success. So you need to find proxies, like milestones, ways that tell you like, hey, is the way this is approached correct or not? By the way, I don't do most of this, right? This gets done one or two levels below. So this is, the accountability culture is the expectation that everybody looks at their work the same way. And then on all this, the more you as a leader can define the metrics and the KPIs all the time and only speak that language, that actually helps everybody like angle towards moving the metrics, right? And I think that helps everybody understand impact equals, it's not my project was green and we shipped it. It's like, oh, we moved these two metrics that matter for the business by that much. Or we give this project that I go to market to generate like 5 million in revenue last quarter, right? And if people use that language, if that's how they think about the quality of their work, then I guarantee you they will start holding themselves accountable towards having that impact. Because people don't like doing work that doesn't matter. Like there are some lazy people out there, but they're not a ton of people. Like in my experience, sorry, this is generalization. I don't know anyone on earth. I've often worked with people who I find quite motivated to do the right thing if you tell them what the right thing is, and we're pretty damn hard on themselves when they don't achieve it. I think where people get frustrated is when there's roadblocks or when it's not clear actually like what's impactful, or when they're told to work on a thing that they don't believe is impactful. Like that's, I think, where you get failure mode. Anyway, I don't know, that was like a rant, but if someone wrote notes and then deleted half of what I said, there's probably something important.
Yeah, I think that's great. And part of it is just hiring managers and, leaders, engineering leaders that you trust, right? And at the end of the day, they have to be accountable for creating the results or, modeling the behavior of what is, high impact, what is accountable. And then, just following through. And eventually, you have to trust them to not understand those details. Yeah. Okay, let's see. Next question. Cutting projects and teams can incur change management challenges and potential expertise loss. How frequent a visit should one visit haircutting? I love that haircutting is now a classic industry term.
Yeah.
I'm just going to use it.
I hope. Yeah, I think it means something else when it's put like that. So now I'm worried. So I don't think I have a right answer. I did this whole. I did a talk one time about reorgs and how like fundamentally. Like you can have big reorgs, not that often, or you can do constant adjustments to try to make sure that you're not accumulating too much extra foliage or like, wayward hairs. I think you should do it. I think you owe it yourself every 6 months as a leader to look at your org shape. Like you may not make changes based on it, but if you don't go deep, if you don't spend like a week every 6 months, like drawing all the things, talking to your managers, directors about where they're finding inefficiencies, finding teams that are frustrated because they don't think they should exist or their mission doesn't make sense or they keep butting heads against somebody. If you don't do that, like you're like not doing part of the role. So you should do it. The question is what happens when you notice? And in my opinion, smaller changes like moving a couple teams, splitting things is not internalized by people as a big deal if you do it pretty often. People get used to it. Now, you're right, you might lose expertise, but what does that mean? That only lose expertise if the person like rage quits your company, right? If you don't have, and if they do that, it means you don't need their expertise right now, right? Because otherwise you would have found something worthwhile for them to do. Or you waited too long to cut, and so the expert realized they've been working on something not impactful, and then it gets cut after they spend 9 months of their life on it and it's never shipping. Nothing more frustrating to somebody, in my opinion, than working on things that don't ship. It's like, that will lose. PMs will lose credibility, EMs will lose credibility, like leadership will lose. The more things you build that you don't ship, the more frustrated people are. Whenever, like big companies, I've sometimes interviewed people where they've worked on like 3 projects, none of them ship over like 3 years. And they're really smart people. And I'm like, oh my God, that sounds so frustrating. They're like, yes, oh my God, it was so frustrating. I was like, well, I promise you, Pod does many things like clowns. Like we're super clowny, right? Like many things we don't do well. We're not clowny about security, but we're like, you know, like we're like a small company. Lots of things we don't do super well. What do we do well? Like we ship, right? And when you work on something, it's like 95% of what we work on ships. Not 100%, right? You get it wrong, but and so at least you will get that feeling of someone using your code, because God, that is a good feeling. But anyways, the point is, like, if you have expertise loss, but you don't need the expertise, it's not a big deal. My point of view is the more often you call, the less likely you actually are to frustrate people, because they understand that you're good at identifying early things that are no longer aligned with what's right for the business. And I think at most big companies, like every 6 months, you do a full org check. I don't know if Facebook operates that way anymore, but 6-7 years ago, Facebook was pretty famous with every 6 months, like changing goals, like altering the org structure at a high level towards them if need be. And it didn't always happen for every team, but you knew it could. And you knew every 6 months was the time when you really looked at what the goals were. And yeah, that was painful, but one, you knew it was coming. So it wasn't like a personal thing. It was part of a process, a way of thinking. Number 2, when it happened, right, you knew that right after it happened, you were going to work on something by definition that was aligned with impact for the business. Because if it wasn't, it would have been cut. That's a good feeling. So I think actually this can be more positive than most people internalize it. I think reorgs where no one understands why it's happening, you know, it's like the chairs are changing, some VPs become SVPs, some director, like that's not helpful. I've never worked at a company that has more than 1,000 engineers. And so I just don't understand the world beyond that. Like I think I'm really good at this world between like 50 and 1,000. And so some of what I said probably doesn't apply at orgs of a certain size. I don't know, Janice, I don't know what your thoughts are on change management.
That makes sense. And I think it's just part of growth mindset, and, you know, everything's changing, right? So, and that's okay as well. Let's move to this question from, from Mike. It says, going back to a very early comment you made, what are some strategies to direct teams and individuals where they're comfortable disagreeing with you?
Yeah. Well, one is you should remind them all the time. So you should tell them, you don't have to listen to me on this. It's okay to disagree. I'm going to set up a meeting for us to talk about it. And then in the meeting, you force them to tell you why they disagree. You're like, what are the worst parts of my idea? Oh, I know you want to do it still, but like, what are the 1,000 things that are wrong with it? So that's just hammered over the top. The second thing goes back to being vulnerable. So I do this. So I do a few things. One of them is I make fun of myself all the time in front of the team. It's a little bit like in baseball. Like in baseball, in the baseball clubhouse, like you always make fun of the best players and you always prop up the young players, right? You don't want anybody in there to get too big of an ego. Forget the analogy. I don't know how many people follow baseball, but the same thing. Like for me, it's like the more senior you're in the org, the more approachable and vulnerable and ability to be wrong you have to make yourself. And you have to like almost like over-index on it so people feel comfortable. And like I'll give you an example of what I do. We do open Q&A at the company, and like I look at the questions 2 days before, and if I think there's no spicy question, I send an email to the entire team that are like, none of these questions are spicy. I want spicy questions. Then I get the spicy questions, right? And sometimes people, you know, they tell me that I'm wrong, and sometimes I don't have good answers. But the signal that it's giving everybody is like, oh, well, if we can make fun of and question like the most senior leader in engineering, then I can feel pretty comfortable challenging a staff engineer or challenging a manager, right? So that's the second part. And then the third part is cultural. So I don't know what growth guide you have. I don't know if you have a set of values or principles by which people operate, but those things need to reflect a culture where it's okay to disagree with one another, and you need to yourself behave and refer to those principles in the moments where you are disagreed with, and so on and so forth. And then finally, I praise people who disagree with me and whether they're correct or not, right? So one thing that a lot of people do is they praise disagreement when the person turns out is correct. But you also really want to praise disagreement when people are incorrect. Because if you only praise it when people are correct, then it actually it's like, it says, yes, it's okay to disagree, but all this like due diligence has to happen beforehand. It's like there's like a threshold of certainty that has to be reached. If you say it's okay to disagree, in a nice, thoughtful way, but even if you're incorrect, if you praise that, then you end up reinforcing the culture from the third point. So remind people, make yourself available and vulnerable, make sure it's a cultural value, and then praise alignment with the disagreement, not with the results of the disagreement. And by the way, it's hard, I think, to create a culture where everybody disagrees with their leader all the time anyway. So it's like hard to imagine over-indexing. I've seen cultures where people don't believe in upper management or don't trust upper management or think upper management is bad. So those things are possible. But if that's what, like, those, if that's the problem that you have, and if that's a culture that you've created, like the first thing you want to do is get feedback coming to you so you realize it. So I think it's a no-brainer.
Yeah, that's a great answer. All of those things are really helpful. The ones that definitely stand out to me is like how you react, when someone, is disagreeing with you, and how you sort of reinforce that culture of feedback, by complimenting them on that in the moment. So that's really great. I've seen a couple of really fun techniques too for, when those discussions happen, where you actually assign and rotate, someone to take an opposite opinion, or have two people that disagree, take the opposite side. Some of those techniques can be pretty fun too, if you find yourself in a situation where you're trying to transition culture. Okay, I think we have we have time for like one more question, and this probably has to be a speed round. So let's see here. Is there a clear criteria to differentiate ratings meets expectations and exceeds expectations? How to respond to the question, tell me what X, Y, and Z I should do to exceed expectations?
Speed round. Well, I hope you can answer the second question. Like, I think the best answer to the second question is like, here are the results that I would like you to achieve in the next 6 months to get exceeds expectation. I mean, if you can define that for the person, then that's great. Maybe the one-up version is like, what do you think you need to do? And then you use that as a way to calibrate what expectations should be. I assume you have a growth guide, right? And I hope it has an impact dimension, and it tells you the kind of behaviors that you expect someone to do to meet the threshold of impact. That's often the language that I would use for it. But it's not, I don't think it's a clear criteria. So before we had levels at Plaid, we just had this exact same question that you have, but it was per person. So for each person, we would say like, this is what you have to do to meet expectations. This is what you have to do to exceed. And everyone kind of had their own little bar, like their own little thing. And we tried to align with impact. And at some point that didn't work anymore because we wanted to be fair to everybody. So we created a growth guide or career ladder, or whatever you call it. But what I ask my managers to do is after each career conversation, you have a development plan, and it should say, if you do these things, you get meets, and if you do these things, it exceeds. And the more concrete you can get about it, the clearer. Now, sometimes you get gamification, which is what I don't like, which is someone looks at the growth guide, they're like, oh, I just need to do this one box, and if I do this one box, I get the promo, and then they're like trying to engineer work to get to the box. And this is why I go back to the thing at the beginning, is like, no, ultimately it has to be about business impact. And so, yes, you have to show these skills, but you have to show these skills towards business impact. And if you don't have a project for that person to get the promo in the 6 months, like sometimes that's just life and it's just what it is. And you, as a manager, you've kind of failed them, right? Because you should find projects that have the business impact that push people to grow their skills. But sometimes you don't, right? And you should just be direct. Hey, listen, like, I don't have a project of that level of complexity. Maybe you can do 2 projects of the lower complexity faster, right? And I'll tell you that if you do those 2, if you can be 25% faster than you were last time at these 2 things, like that's not enough to get a promo because you won't have shown the next set of skills, but that's enough to get an exceed. But you got to get concrete about it. This is really hard, by the way. Just like, I think, in a business where there's clear ways to measure impact and where you can define the KPIs really well, it's easy. On really long-lived projects where it's harder to do, I think I've struggled with this as well. And I think yeah, I think this is where a strong relationship with an IC and being able to define it helps. The final thing on this, which I hate, and I hate when this happens to me, it's when I can't do a promo because the company won't let me. This has happened to me in the past where like the promos were boxed, right? There was like a percentage. And so then I had someone that exceeded, but they didn't have as much impact as someone else, but they still exceeded, but I was stopped from giving an exceed. That's like the worst feeling in the world. And I don't have a solution for that, but
yeah, that might have to be another discussion. We'll have to,
I don't know what to do. It's just,
do a round two.
Anyway.
Anyway, that should wrap it up. I just, it's been so fun being with you here today. Thank you to Plato for bringing us together. Thank you to JD for sharing your wisdom with us, and all about qualities of a great senior engineering leader. I wish everybody a wonderful day who's in the audience, and thank you, JD.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I appreciate being here. Thank you for the questions, Janice. Always fun to chat. So I look forward to next time. Have a good time, everybody.